So this week's topic focuses on gender and how gender connects with foreign policy and with organizations. And so as part of that conversation, we'll be drawing on two resources, and the conversation today will try to introduce those resources and maybe put them in a broader perspective so folks kind of know what they're supposed to be pulling out of them. One of the articles that we'll be reading is Too Much That Can't Be Said by Anne-Marie Goetz and Natalie Floria Hudson. And this is an interesting kind of article. It's a dialogue between these two individuals about the work that they've done, both in sort of academic work on gender and feminist theory, and also work through international organizations, specifically the United Nations. And it brings forward a lot of different pieces. And I want to kind of have a conversation around that. But I also want to flag the second resource that we're using this week, which is a TEDx talk for TEDx Grand Forks that was given by Carolyn Beecraft a number of years ago. Carolyn is a former Secretary of the Navy, a UND alum, and was really instrumental in getting policy changed in the United States to allow women to serve in a combat role in the military. And so she shares some of her experiences sort of working through the military and the foreign policy infrastructure, and also working around gender and policy. So again, another really useful resource, but I want to maybe build some foundation for folks to really get the most out of that. And as a result, I'm going to kind of break from my normal pattern of PowerPoint, and maybe talk a little bit more just directly about some of the themes and concepts that I think folks will want to have in the back of their minds as they're working through these materials. So just some foundational stuff when we're thinking about gender. So gender and sex casually get used interchangeably, but are actually two very different things, right? Sex is the biology piece, it's the chromosomes, it's genitalia. Gender is about culture. Gender is about the ideas and the scripts that we sort of attach to men and to women and what that means. And that can change over time, right? So when I think about the script that my father had for what it means to be a man, that was different than the script that my grandfather had. And neither of them are working with the same script for masculinity as I am. My script involves cardigan sweaters. It's much closer to Mr. Rogers than my grandfather, who was very much a bar fighter. So those scripts can change over time. Those scripts can be different from one culture to another, right? I mean, the markers of masculinity in the United States may not be markers of masculinity in Pakistan or in Japan. They may look different because those scripts are culturally grounded. And then it's also worth keeping in mind that those scripts can be different depending on class, depending on race, depending on sexual orientation. In the gender studies literature, this is talked about as intersectionality, that we can't just think about gender because the scripts for being a man who is white are maybe different than the scripts for being a man who is black. And that when we're thinking about how gender operates, we can't just sort of assume that it's all going to be the same for everybody, because it's not, because we are intersectional. We have multiple identities, and those multiple identities interact. So again, just something to kind of keep in the back of our minds when we're thinking about some of these things. It's also maybe just a good jumping off point to remember that gender is really a complex kind of thing. Gender doesn't always map to sexuality in a neat and tidy way. We sort of culturally in the United States like to sort of sort gender into two binary categories. It doesn't always work that way for everybody. And so when we're, again, thinking about gender, we're not thinking about these sort of rigid boxes. We're talking about broader sort of patterns that sort of make up and undergird our culture and our society. So with that kind of as background, it's maybe not going to be surprising that I'm going to make this observation, and that is that oftentimes I have observed men will take the view that gender as a topic of study is something for women. And certainly women have been really pioneers in driving gender research forward and developing feminist theories of a variety of different stripes, which we'll talk about. But men have gender. we men have gender, and we are operating and interacting with those same scripts that women are, and they affect us in similar kinds of ways and in different kinds of ways. And there are interesting and important things to keep in mind. And so I always like to reinforce for the guys in my courses that when we're talking about gender, we're talking about something that is central to our lives as men. When we're talking about gender, we're talking about something that's central to the women in the class's lives, that this is something that's part of the human experience. So the good news is, because women who have studied gender for decades have done a lot of the work, we can sort of swoop in a little bit later and maybe sort of pick up some of their insights and benefit from their experiences in terms of pushing back against some of the blind spots that have evolved in social science theory. And what I want to actually elaborate on that a little bit, because I think it's a really important way to think about this, that I'm a pretty hardcore social scientist. I'm interested in data, I'm interested in theories, I'm interested in hypothesis testing, and a lot of the theories that we'll be talking about of feminist theories and gender theories don't necessarily do that sort of thing in the way that I'm used to seeing it. And so for a long time, I sort of said, okay, these are interesting things, but they're sort of over there. They're not really social science. They're maybe more like the humanities, where we're working with things like identity and norms and ideas and culture, but maybe not social science in the way that I do it. And then I kind of stepped back and was thinking about what it is that social science does, and what does a good theory of social science do for us. And a good theory for social science takes a really complicated world, a messy world, and says you don't need to pay attention to all that stuff, that there are a select number of things that you need to pay attention to, and that will help you to navigate this world, right? That these are the things that will help you to make predictions. These are things that will help you with policy. And that's what a theory does. It says, ignore that, look here. And the feminist theories that we'll be talking about today, which include liberal feminism, critical feminism, and difference feminism, really do those same kind of tasks. They say there's a lot of stuff you could be paying attention to. There's a lot of things you could be thinking about. But I want you to take a second, ask these questions, and look at this thing here, because there's interesting stuff happening there. And if you don't ask these questions, and if you don't take the extra step to look there, you're going to miss it. And if you miss it, you're going to have predictions that are incomplete and are biased. You're going to have policy responses that are incomplete and biased, and that's going to be a problem. And so over the years, my own personal sort of understanding of gender theory has really shifted. And now I see it as a very powerful tool in the social scientist's toolbox to be able to hone in on things that are interesting and important in social dynamics. And so with that as my jumping off point, I want to kind of talk through those three different types of feminist theory. And they surface in the Hudson and Goetz discussion in a variety of different ways, but I think it's maybe worth sort of setting the stage. So when we're talking about critical feminism, we're talking about a way of thinking about gender that sees power as really intertwined with gender, and that there are power structures out there in the world that have been sort of built into institutions and norms and laws and ideas that systematically work against women and systematically disadvantage women or disempower women, and that those things are not sort of by accident. Those things are real, and they shape the world, and they propagate or reify or continue these patterns of oppression. Liberal feminism actually has sort of a similar sort of view, but comes at it less focused on power and more focused on reform and fixing things. And so liberal feminism might say, okay, where are the women at in a situation, in an organization, at the United Nations, within the bureaucracy? Where are they at? What are they doing? Are they represented in a way that gives them full and equal voice? Really seeing women's rights as human rights, and working in sort of advocacy kind of way to realizing those rights. And so if there's a gender imbalance in the bureaucracy, liberal feminism would say, okay, let's dig into that. Let's figure out how to fix that problem. Let's identify the barriers. And a lot of the conversation between Hudson and Goetz focuses on those kind of things, about how do you get an organization to work in a way where women can be successful and are represented in a full range of positions. So there's talk about organizational charts, and there's talk about budgets, and there's talk about power. And it's actually a lot of the same things that Carolyn B. Craft is talking about in her TED Talk. Um, One of the things that Goetz noted is that when she shows up at the UN to work, and she's put in charge of sort of a gender equality agenda in security, that there's just no data for her to work with, that there's just nothing collected, that there's all sorts of statistics coming in about war, but nothing on rape, nothing on the role of women in peace building, nothing about women in economics, in conflict situations. The women are just simply not counted and not documented and not present. And so a big part of her job was to collect that information and to bring that information forward and present it to policymakers within the UN to try to say, okay, here we have a problem, and this problem needs to be dealt with. And so I think this actually is a nice illustration of liberal feminism versus critical feminism, and how they sort of ask those questions or approach those things. That liberal feminism says, okay, where's the data? It doesn't exist. Okay, let's go out and systematically collect that data. Whereas difference feminism would say, or I'm sorry, critical feminism would say, yeah, there's a reason why that data doesn't exist. Let's step back and understand why rape was not something that the United Nations viewed as a problem in conflict zones for decades, that was just simply not defined as security, that was not defined as a problem, that was not defined as something that required a response. Why was that? And we can only understand why that was by thinking about gender and about thinking about those power differentials between men and women, and how men and women experience the world. So again, keying in on different important questions to ask. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about difference feminism, which Hudson and Goetz kind of critique, and then I think kind of circle back to in an interesting way. And so difference feminism sort of begins with the idea that we can't just sort of tally up how many women are in an organization. We need to recognize that the experiences that men and women have in society, in organizations, in life are just different. And that we need to recognize that difference, and we need to understand that difference, and we need to work with that difference. And Hudson and Goetz kind of take a crack at that it risks falling into sort of an essentialist kind of language. And what they mean by that, they give the example of, oh, well, women are just more peaceful, or women are better peace builders. And they sort of shake their head and say, that's not really how that works. That again, gender is not this sort of nice and tidy box. Gender is a fluid collection of patterns, that what may be true of one individual may not be true of other individuals. And that's just really missing a lot of the complexity of what's going on. But there are other ways to think about difference feminism, or to apply difference feminism, that I think help maybe tease out some of the differences that are worth paying attention to. Specifically, how society understands the different things that men and women do. And I see this a lot in my work. I study civil wars, and I frequently read about, horrific atrocities, civilians being attacked. And there's a phrase that often gets used, of women and children. And the way that phrase gets used is almost universally as victims. And when we look at what happens in a conflict situation, right? So when the Lord's Resistance Army comes sweeping into a village in the Democratic Republic of Congo and is going to murder and rape and burn everything they can get their hands on. Typically what happens is a handful of men in the village scramble for the handful of weapons in the village and try ineffectually to fight off invaders. Women grab the children and get into the forest and spend time in the forest with children who are terrified, comforting them, surviving in the elements, keeping the kids alive, hiding as patrols go out and look for survivors, keeping things together, keeping kids alive, and then returning to life and rebuilding. And it always strikes me as bizarre, that the guy who runs to get the gun to ineffectually protect the village is held up in sort of a heroic model, whereas the woman who kept children alive, who made sure that the most vulnerable were cared for and protected at a moment of extreme danger, that is treated as a category of victimhood. And difference feminism would point that out. It would say it's not just that they're doing different things, right? It's that we as a society are looking at those different things and valuing them differently. And one gets held up as heroism and one is sort of dismissed as victimhood. In one case, you are an actor and a doer and in control of your own destiny. And in the other case, you are being acted upon. And again, these are things that you wouldn't necessarily flag or catch onto when sort of reading the newspaper. But difference feminism and liberal feminism and critical feminism all kind of get us to ask those questions that can maybe open up interesting angles or insights into a situation that we might not have anticipated when we just sort of walked in the door and started looking around. And that's why these are really useful frameworks for thinking about the social world.